So I'm very pleased to introduce Paul Gosselin. He's the Deputy Director for Sustainable Water Management. And in this role, he oversees, among others, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office, which of course is responsible for implementation of SGMA, as well as the Division of Regional Assistance. And prior to this, he served as Butte County's Director of Water and Resource Conservation for 13 years. We're very grateful he could join us today to give us his perspective on California groundwater issues.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for having me here today. And so actually it was better they did this and had you grab lunch, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about, it's usually, the previous speakers had a lot of good positive things happening that's going on, and I'm going to be laying out sort of the other end. It's going to be wah, wah, wah. And right before lunch, it's sort of like, really, that's what we left going into lunch with. So, but I will have some, I'll build off some of the other speakers and talk about some of the positive things that have been going on. And one thing, before I get into it, I am going to set the stage on groundwater conditions and then talk a bit about Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and climate change, the two main drivers. But a lot of what I'm talking about is really being driven by a lot of data acquisition, one that the state's doing, but also local agencies, which has been enormous over the last 10 years. So the amount of data that we have now compared to 10 years ago is phenomenal, and it really is just going to continue, and that's one of the main facets for us to get out of the dilemma we're in. So, setting the stage, California, I think for people in California kind of know this, but if you don't, there's 515 basins throughout the state. And under another law, not the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, but under another law that was passed in 2009 that dealt with statewide monitoring, they were characterized into high and medium priority basins. And really this reflects not whether the basin's sustainable or not, but how important is groundwater. So it's like how much ag acres, what's the census look like, how many wells are there, so how important. So those are all high and medium priority basins. And then there's 21 critically overdrafted, and the law required us to identify the ones that were critically overdrafted. These are the ones that have the greatest challenges with groundwater sustainability. So a couple of these slides just setting the stage that groundwater overdraft in many basins is very, very significant. We've been losing, and you can see from the charts, groundwater overdraft has been persistent in a lot of areas. Going up to, the 2004, we've had over 5,000 square miles of subsidence. 5,000 square miles of subsidence, the land sinking, and that's inelastic subsidence. In over 20 years, we have had about half the wells the past 20 years have had decline. So it's been persistent, but that's where I think some of the work that's going on at local agencies is going to get us out. And again, groundwater level trends, we have an enormous amount of data going back years, and I will make a plug for what's called Cal Groundwater Live, and it's on the Natural Resources Agency's webpage. You can get information as soon as it comes into the department on groundwater elevations, wells going in, subsidence rates, dry wells, and you can break it down by year analysis, by basin, by county, so it's really good analysis. So these kind of trends are going to be very, very important. I will say the last recent years, we may be looking at some positive uptick in storage and groundwater elevations, but we'll need to really take a look at the trends over time. We're hoping the programs that Sustainable Groundwater Management Act have put into the local level are coming into play. Again, extractions, recharge, and change in storage. These are other data that we collect, we compile, and can report out. Characterizing recharge and trying to, quantify it and track it has become increasingly more important. You heard from the last panel how important that is. So from the state, us to being able to track that, throughout basins is very, very important. And I'll get into recharge a little bit. But one thing we are looking at, too, is sort of an indicator is change in storage. And that's something that the groundwater sustainability agencies have to report annually. And that's really a good indicator if you look at all the variables, maybe a good benchmark to look at. But we have had continuous, in some basins, real decline in storage. And then subsidence. This is one, and I'll talk again when I talk about Sigma, the importance of subsidence management. But we have seen over the years, particularly in dry years, a real uptick in subsidence. One of my scientists describes it as the ball bouncing down the staircase. It bounces and then we'll have a wet year and it looks like, oh, a little rebound and things are better. But then drought and we hit a new low and it's just staircasing down and down and down and it has not stopped. And what was more troubling, it's gone, it's kind of shown up in areas that we didn't expect it to show up. Obviously down the San Joaquin Valley to Leary Lake Basin, historic persistence there over the years, but starting to see it up in the Sac Valley, and that's where Butte County is, where I had managed in the county there for a number of years before going to the state. That was something that, for the managers up there, shook their boots. One, we didn't think that the geology was conducive to it. Two, you really needed to pump a lot of groundwater to start really extracting that down and causing subsidence. And, that started to occur on the west side of Sac Valley, which is very troubling. So, but the managers there are taking that to heart and putting a lot of work into arresting it. And then dry wells. Again, we're tracking right now, still over the years with probably, I think, the last drought, probably a good $400,000 of investment to address the dry well situation in many communities. And that also includes money we had, about $200 million to deal with community service well improvements throughout the state, particularly in disadvantaged communities. But right now, we still have homes, probably well over 1,000 homes, that haven't had water in some cases, for a couple years, and they're still waiting. And so the state, we're doling out, probably $1 million a month in emergency water deliveries, and that's not sustainable. So we've had a couple good years, kind of balanced years. We've started to see a flattening and not a big uptick in dry wells. It doesn't help those people who are sitting there. You can imagine going home now and not having water. Not having water for today, tonight, tomorrow, and for weeks on end, let alone for years. So what's going to happen is the next drought, and we may be staring that down. We're not looking for any sort of atmospheric conditions for weeks out. We do need, we can get a couple storms to help us out, but my mind, I'm always staring down the drought is right here at our doorstep, and we may be facing that. And if that happens, then all bets are off. We're going to see a huge uptick in dry wells. And right now, the problem we have is the last drought, the state had a real benefit of real good budget surplus, so we're able to bring resources down to help communities. That's not the case anymore. So there's expectation that the state's going to come in to help, but unless we go draw into reserves or contingencies, the money's just not there. The general fund is pretty much in dire straits. So this is pretty troubling. We do have a statewide, I call it the Drought Task Force. It's called the Drought Resiliency Interagency Partnership. And one of the things we're going to talk about this year in a work group is the roles, responsibilities at the state level and local level on how to address dry wells, particularly during droughts. So with all that, things don't look great. A lot of challenges out there. And then we have two other drivers really driving California groundwater issues. One is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that was passed in 2014. So, we're well within a decade of having that law in place. The other is climate change. And, we've seen the last, recent years we've had swings between the wettest year on record, followed by the worst drought in thousands of years, followed by the wettest year yet again, and then the worst drought. So again, we're ratcheting these extremes in ways that I don't think any of us anticipated it would come home as quickly as it did. But again, revisiting the 515 basins in the state, these were the ones that are subject to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And when the law was getting put in, there was a lot of discussions about where should this come into play? Should it be in basins? Should it be in counties? Do we need to define other sort of areas to do? And knowing the time frame to implement, the easiest thing was to go with the established basins that the department establishes and updates through what we call, it's a Bulletin 118. It's called California Groundwater. We just updated that report that's in draft form, so you can look at that. It's a good compilation resource of a whole range of groundwater data and issues from the last 5 years, as well as recommendations. But the basins are defined in that. These basins, actually, it worked out real well, even though it was a convenient thing when the law was put in. But it does cover the high and medium priority basins, cover over 95% of all the groundwater extractions in the state. So it really did hit home to really where we need to be. So in these basins, the way the law, I'll jump to the next slide. I'll be sitting on this slide for a while. The way the law is intended is within these basins, high and medium priority basins, they have to develop, well, there has to be covered by one or more groundwater sustainability agency. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act just created a flurry of new acronyms and new agencies and a whole range of new terms we had to deal with. So groundwater sustainability agencies. The law gave huge flexibility for locals to decide how they want to organize themselves locally. So it did allow, you could have one agency, and some agencies gained each group together in a joint powers authority. Others remained independent. So some basins have 16 different groundwater sustainability agencies. And again, groundwater sustainability agencies are public agencies that either have water management authority, flood management, or land use authority. So that brings in the counties and the cities. And the basin has to be covered by one or more. It was also presumed if no agency stepped up and covered part of the basin, it was presumed the county would be the agency to fill in the gap. So the county was the backstop on that. So we saw the range of agencies getting formed in these basins. I had 3 basins in Butte County, and they were all formed differently. And you would think, well, they should all be the same. I thought they would be, but you get into individual dynamics and how people want to work together. One of the things that when the law was passed, I was telling people this is going to be less about the data and science, because we have a lot of smart people in the state. We'll be able to work through that. It's really about the success is going to be, are people going to work together within a basin for the greater good, or are they going to keep within their own confines and just look out for themselves? And I think as we get into it, where we've seen successes and things work is where they've had the working relationship, and where things are falling apart, it's people have entrenched themselves for their own parochial needs. So you have local agencies. It was really geared that the decisions need to be managed locally, which really flips the law on its head from what typical state programs cover. Usually the state comes down and we would kind of define terms and kind of oversee implementation down to, a gnat's ass. And that's where you get into a lot of problems with state agencies. This was different. It really kept us at an arm's length on those decisions at the local level, even to the point on how agencies decide to form, how they want to decide to get towards sustainability. That is a local call. There's going to be disagreements locally, and those have happened, but they have to be local. So our role in this at the department, and there was a lot of discussion about which agencies should oversee this, either us, the State Water Resources Control Board, and they do water rights and most of enforcement. We have the data planning piece, and for those wonky nerds, we're in 2 different secretariats, which also creates sort of different cultures and different things. So they ended up splitting it up. and having us, Department of Water Resources, play the primary role as setting the standards, overseeing the basins, providing assistance to basins, but also kind of evaluating, one is, are they in compliance with the law and regulations? We have regulations we've established. And two, are they on path for sustainability? So if any of those things start to fall apart, there's a process that we evaluate basins initially with their initial plan, and then we kind of have what's called periodic evaluation, that almost a check-in from the basin on their progress. Has to happen at least every 5 years, but we can do that at any time. So we have a continuous oversight of how basins are implementing the act, including the annual reports. So if we do find that basins are not on track or their plan isn't compliant, what we typically do is we can call them incomplete and kind of a corrective measure and give them 6 months to resolve the issue, and we try to work with them on that. We can't tell them what to do, but we can guide them on how to get there. And then if they don't, this is where the State Water Resources Control Board comes in as the enforcement arm. And the way that is kind of going, once it leaves the department and goes to the state board, you're starting to lose local control. You're going down the path that the state's saying, you know, you're not on track, we need you to fix this, this, and this to get back on track and have local control. And if you don't, what happens, it starts with the board can put a basin into what's called probation, and they start the data information collection phase. They start collecting monitoring data and assessing fees to cover the cost. And after a year, if the basin doesn't resolve issues, the board can impose what's called an interim plan to bring the basin towards sustainability. And the only real tool the board has is to limit pumping. So again, the driver is get back to local control, resolve issues as quickly as possible, because the state cannot bring basins to sustainability even under an interim plan. It doesn't work. These things have to be done locally. And so what are these plans intending to do? This was a dilemma in the law. It was sort of like, how do you define sustainability? And there was a grappling, like, you know, real difficult to define. What was a breakthrough was not what we wanted to get to, but what we wanted to avoid. So the whole premise on sustainability was avoiding what's called undesirable results. The bad things you don't want to have happen, and presuming that if the bad things aren't happening, all things are good. I don't know if that's true, but that's the way the law is set up. So the 6 undesirable results, and this is where the groundwater sustainability agencies have to look at each one of these 6 indicators in different parts of the basin and evaluate lowering of groundwater levels, reduction in storage, seawater intrusion, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and depletion of interconnected surface waters. On how we're managing the basin, is this affecting groundwater uses and users, including the environment, including domestic wells, ag wells, community service wells, and they need to evaluate, are there problems there, and if they do, then they need to adjust how they're managing the basin or resolve those issues to avoid that. So, you know, it's very difficult work if you haven't been involved in a groundwater sustainability agency. You know, it's an enormous amount of work. These plans are over 1,000 pages, a lot of modeling and other data. And we know there's going to be a lot of data gaps, and so it is going to be a journey. The other facet we have is assistance, and so over the last, since Sigma, we've issued roughly about half a billion dollars in grants to local agencies, and also provide technical assistance, so agencies that need monitoring well installation, we have a program for that, as well as facilitation services. There's a lot of disruptions at local agencies, and facilitators have been enormously helpful. I used it when I was in Butte County, as well as translation services, and we have now a new program, Ruth is here too, on outreach to small ag, and this was done in Proposition 4. We had a program in the department with some partners outreaching to disadvantaged communities and agriculture and others. And now this is getting folded into the SIGMO group under Prop 4. So we're real excited about that. One of the feedbacks we heard from growers and and from GSAs is outreach and how to engage particularly small growers in this who don't have farm managers, who are trying to do all the paperwork on all the regulatory requirements, and it's just enormously difficult. And as these allocations and other limitations come on, inevitably the ones who have the least economic ability to take them on are going to get hit, and that's a lot of the small or disadvantaged growers. So outreach for them will help them along the way. Again, this is a busy slide. I kind of covered it, different bench points along the way. So even basins that have had their initial plan approved, I've told them it's conditionally approved, because we can come back even on basins that have approved plans. You know, there was a lot of corrective actions and other things, and if those aren't addressed or projects aren't getting implemented, you know, we could go down the path of having a basin that had been initially approved but go to the board after subsequent review, because we do expect progress to continue. So this really just fits in, you know, the avenue we have on an evaluation. But it also, when we do evaluate plans, it's a feedback loop for us on assistance and other support agencies need. Because if we start to see things really slip or common problems, it's a feedback to us that either we need to get some additional assistance out, or do we need additional guidance or other things? Because again, we're in the business to want to have the local agencies succeed, because that's the only way we're going to get to sustainability. So where we stand, and everyone sort of likes like bench cards and everything, but out of all the reviews, we have 81 approved basins, and again, these are plans that largely even the law calls, they have to be significantly compliant. So they're in the ballpark. No plan's perfect. We expect them to all adapt over time. But really what we focused in on was, did they cover all the elements, but more importantly, did they cover the sustainable management criteria in the law? And it's more than just ending overdraft. It's more than just balancing the input and output of the basin. It's back to that undesirable results. Did they take a look adequately about where they are intending to have the basin level off and be sustainable? How does that affect groundwater uses and users in the basin? Are you depleting interconnected surface water that it's affecting some species or others? Or is it going to dry wells, shallow domestic wells, or a whole range of things? So we need to have it look through that lens and take a look at that. So we did have a number of basins that we did after a six-month incomplete process go to the board as inadequate. The board, State Water Resources Control Board, works with those agencies. We kind of take a step back in the background because they're the lead, but they work with them to try to resolve the deficiencies that were found. They did have 3 basins returned to us, and these were before they went into probation. So Kern, Kauai, and Chowchilla, which is very good. So they were basically, the way that process works, it's interesting. You get, you know, the law, I describe it like one of these Rube Goldberg machines, and, you know, 100 years of groundwater water law gets changed, and you turn on this, you know, law and hope that it doesn't have any glitches. And this is one thing, basins coming back to us from the board, came back. We haven't seen that basin in about almost 2 years. They totally revamped their plan once or twice, so we need to start new. So we're out talking to those basins now, getting to up to speed with them, reviewing their plan, and continuing down that process. So the pattern will continue. There are 4 basins right now with the board that are under state intervention. 2 are in probation, Tulare Lake and Tule, and then they have evaluations on the others. And then we have 4 basins now that are incomplete, that we're trying to work out some deficiencies we identified with them in 6 months. So, you know, one, I do want to say with this law, which was huge and it totally turned California water law on its head, and I know Don, I don't know if Don's still here, but a lot of reluctance, concern by a lot of growers on this and a lot of agencies. But the one thing that really stood out is, even though there's a couple basins having problems, by and large, every deadline that was put in the law had been met, particularly at the local level, and the involvement locally has really been astounding. So even though, and it's hard, I've been working with agriculture for 35 years and knowing the challenges and difficulties growers have, and knowing particularly what this is going to do in terms of the future of agriculture, to still embrace it and participate, knowing that the challenges lie ahead, is really, really phenomenal. And I, would have thought it could have gone the other way. But it really is a testament to, I think, the work in agriculture and the work in these basins. So it is astounding, and we're going to continue along those lines. So one of the things that we do when we do reviews, again, is a feedback, and one area that we did find that, one, besides what the data shows, but two, in the plans, they're dealing with subsidence was really not addressed well. So that was an area we decided to do a best management practice document that we issued last July in draft, went out for comment. Best management practice documents can lead to regulations. We were kicking around the idea about being a little bit more prescriptive on subsidence, but as we were looking at it, it made more sense now to stick with the BMP, provide the GSAs with broad guidance, but we are going to hold them accountable to implement the plan probably as quickly as practicable. So we'll be working in partnership with the board, because some of the basins are under board jurisdiction, to quickly, probably next month, start talking with the basins on reintroducing the subsidence best management practice document, and start having individual discussions with basins on what have they done, where are they thinking about implementation of that, particularly schedule and timing on raising groundwater levels to start addressing subsidence. And I do want to speak that subsidence is more than just a checkbox indicator. We talk about, and I'll talk about recharge too, and that's a water supply enhancement. And somebody asked about conveyance being important for recharge and other water supplies, and it is true. And the department did a couple months ago a conveyance study, trying to evaluate the conveyance needs throughout the state to deal with these sort of issues in water supply. And what came down is, yeah, there are some areas where there's some needed conveyance, but the primary driver is the existing conveyance is being impacted by subsidence in many of these areas, and that's cutting off water supply. So the most important thing right now is subsidence is a water supply project. It's not for the sake of doing it, because right now the California aqueduct could lose up to 80% of its capacity by 2040 because of subsidence. The Fine Current Canal, has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to keep pace, and the new subsidence doesn't even account for the retrofits that are being put in place. So we're also taking hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars of public money, local agency money, state, federal money, to chase our tails around, chasing subsidence around. So it has to start, we need to turn the corner on it, both for securing the surface water deliveries, but also the other damage that's causing to levees, roads, and others. The other area that we do need to work on is depletion of interconnected surface waters. This was a new area for water managers. It was put in the law, but there really isn't an off-the-shelf methodology on how you monitor that, how you manage that. So we've spent the last 2 years developing a guidance document. We put out some scientific papers to lay the foundation. So we'll be issuing this guidance document later this year. I think we want to give some breathing room to let the subsidence BMP settle in. And the importance of all this is, just keeping on track for groundwater sustainability, as difficult as it is. It is going to impact a lot of the communities. PPIC was talking 500,000 to 1 million acres of ag land going out because of this, just lack of groundwater and surface water. Some thought it may be more than that, but that's something, again, on the supply side with recharge, we need to do all we can to augment that, to minimize the impact to agriculture and communities. And so some of the programs talked earlier about GoBiz and Jobs First is real important, but I'll get to that. The other important piece with all this, if we were just dealing with the status quo, groundwater sustainability piece, that'd be fine. But like I said, the last couple of years, we've really seen the impact of climate change hit home through aridification. And that's just the steady increase of temperature. So we've seen that and analyzed that, and it's really profound. We've seen that up in the snowpack. Even now it's pretty warm up there for snowpack and changes in precipitation. But the other thing, the temperature itself is going to create its own water supply. So it was estimated roughly just the aridification by 2040, you're talking about another 10% of the water supply in California taken off the top, right? And we're trying to implement Sigma. So real double whammy. So the governor came out with a water supply strategy dealing with a hotter, drier future. This was in 2022, August, September of 2022. We were staring down going in, remember that? It's hard to remember, but we're going into the 4th year of a drought, and pretty much all the other, and that was the mega drought that was worse since 1,000 years, right? And we were staring down the 4th year of that, and we weren't sure what things else we could pull out to deal with that. And then, of course, the atmospheric rivers hit in 2023, and that changed a lot of the discussion on thoughts we had on recharge. So as we went through, and I just want to talk 2023, there was a lot of effort. We talked temporary permits. Again, prior to 2023, agencies that have been trying the temporary permits, some goods for some ill, very difficult challenges, but it was good they identified some problems. And so we're continuing grinding on that. But when the floodwaters hit and atmospheric rivers hit, that's where we really started to see the nexus between flood management and groundwater management, not just outside, but also within the department. We were meeting, a lot of you probably at least every day and more, just in emergency services dealing with the floods. And so we were looking at ways to help flood management with flood diversions, and the board had a policy, somewhat informal policy that, if there's a flood diversion, agency saying like there's an imminent flood risk downstream, you can pull water off without a permit and incidentally recharge, but primarily it's for health and safety. So they took that, we took that and kind of brought it into a broader governor executive order, which was a huge sea change, I think, for a lot of people, because it opened up, I think, clarity on how that can be done. And it really got dialogues between us, flood management at the state and local level, to talk to each other. So what it really showed was, in these areas, we have a lot of areas where there's imminent flood risk that we can pull water off and put it on lands. As Don mentioned, we had put out some temporary pumps. We also put some money towards land clearing, clearing the land. Some of these lands were ready to be put in as groundwater basins, but they were sitting in 2022 going, it's another dry year, why am I going to clear it now? So we went in and cleared those, and that increased infiltration rates by about 30%. So we really learned a lot, and I think agriculture learned a lot too, and a lot of growers started to think that, I'm not going to be able to farm all this land, but I can take a portion near, let's say, the creek or stream that floods, use that as a recharge basin or a diversion basin for these constant floods that happen, and I'll incidentally recharge, will benefit me, benefit the basin. We saw that some GSAs took that and made some adjustment to their allocation limits, which is good. Even though it's not a water right, there's benefits. So we started really tracking the permitted and unpermitted recharge out there since 2023. And so I do want to say 2023 was a bellwether year because of the atmospheric rivers, but it really brought a lot of the things we've been hearing home on how to improve the temporary permit system, but also how flood management can work in a recharge setting with agriculture, and it even begs the question, like, recharge basins and others should be viewed as part of your agronomic practice. And so that's a discussion we need to continue, not sort of as some separate appendage. So again, I started to work through this list. The executive order was codified into law that July. There were things, just because dealing with the legislative process, there were concerns about how things were put in place and how things would carry out. So there were some extra things put into the code about having a county flood plan, which largely don't exist. So we issued another executive order waiving that for the time being while we go out and work with counties to develop the local flood plans to comply. But we've been doing a lot of outreach with within the department, also with CDFW and our flood management group up in Sac Valley, and we want to replicate that down in San Joaquin Valley. So part of that too, and it was discussed also, the totem, but we also had started doing the larger helicopter flyovers for the entire basins throughout the state as a foundation element. And this really helps us identify, like, where are the pathways to get water in the ground where we can actually put it to use and not have it lost. This actually has been enormously helpful, and then you can come back in locally with a totem to refine it if need be. But it also is a building block with the other data we get from GSAs on this basin characterization. And so even though agencies are getting stuck, we got stuck with not a lot of new funding coming through, but we have data resources that we can help develop, and basin characterization is one of those, to help fill data gaps that local agencies have. So we're working with agencies to help better characterize their basins for recharge and other projects. So it's pretty exciting. So again, two relevant studies and why the basin characterization is important. We had two important studies. One was the San Joaquin Valley basin-wide study looking at opportunities, and Floodmar came out to be a big topic on how you reoperate reservoirs and use that flood releases and actually use that to store it either in a bank or recharge. So knowing where those places are is going to be critically important. So basin characterization is finding those places where in California groundwater we have upwards of 8 to 12 times more storage underground than all the reservoirs combined. So this is the place where we can do it. That law that was put in place on the flood diversion actually defined groundwater as natural infrastructure. So that was a nice kicker. The other is the conveyance study that I mentioned, and again, did identify areas where there could be needs for conveyance, and we do have money in Proposition 4 for that, but also really honed in, the big problem is subsidence. We need to tackle subsidence, not for its own sake, but for water supply assurance. And so that's going to be critically important this year. And again, more work on flood recharge with Ferromar. We have Proposition 4 funding, roughly just about almost $380 million. So a year from now, we'll be coming out with grant guidance on that. We are working on permit reforms with the board and CDFW, so the status quo is not satisfied. We need to get better movement on that, and then continuing our technical assistance. So with that, other resources available, I think it was touched upon that. A lot of this is going to involve every agency to bring us to address the groundwater issues and sustainability. But I do want to make one last plug. These issues are going to really be paramount at the local level. So the nexus with the land use and land use planning is going to be very, very critically important. So, because land use decisions are water decisions. So with that, I want to thank you. And if we do have a couple minutes for questions, I'll entertain it. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. We do have a couple minutes for questions.
Stephanie's not going to let me off the hook.
Just wondering what you make of the drought monitor saying we're not in a drought anymore. And I'll be asked at the board level at some point, so I'd like to take your answer and use it.
So, I don't know, I live in a world of analogy. So I think it's sort of like, okay, that drought monitor thing, we haven't been in, 25 years since we've been drought-free, after I stopped snickering. But it's almost like you're sitting in the gas station and you filled your tank, and you're like, I have a full tank. And you're driving away, it's sort of like, are you going to say, like, by the time I got here to Fresno from Chico, it's sort of like, I had a full tank. I had a full tank. It's a point in time. Since that came out, and why I was snickering is, we knew from the climatologists we were going to have probably a good month of no events going through, right? So staring down into February at the earliest. So I think the snowpack's down to under 60% of average right now. So, but California is complicated, so the National Drought Monitor doesn't really fit for us because it's so diverse, like the LA fires. LA didn't have, I think they had 1 inch of rain for over a year. Well, Northern California and the rest of the state was doing real fine. So depending upon where you sit and what water supply portfolio, depends on if you're in a drought or not. So we've tried to come up with indicators that better reflect California. So we've tried California Water Watch that we have that better reflects sort of the true story in California, which is huge and diverse and different depending upon where you're sitting. So.
Hi. Just want to see if you have any insight, I know it's a different department, into what it will take for the basins that have been referred over to probationary status to get out of that. And then particularly in Tulare Lake, since they're not a part of the state plan of flood control, if there are any efforts to integrate them and really get them to be more of a part of the FloodMAR project.
So I'll kind of go backwards. So Tulare Lake is not in the state plan of flood control. I think that was a statutory, so I think it would take a statutory change to bring them in. But flood diversions under 1242.1, you don't need to be in the state plan of flood control to use it. That can go anywhere. So they could use flood diversions if they meet all the criteria. So that could come into play. I'm not sure who's managing flood management down there, but there has to be someone who wears that hat to make the call that there's an imminent flood risk, and then, things can go. Now, to bring basins that are with the board, to bring them back, and I will say the law is very directive about intending that should be a short stay, that they do not want the state to hang on basins, and I'll tell you, between us and the board, none of us want basins under the jurisdiction of the board, I think even including the board, because it's not conducive to getting to sustainability. But with that said, I'd say the big difference between the basins that are still with the board, and they've only acted on 2 of the basins on probation, but the basins that got returned to us, from when we sent them to the board, from when they came back, the big difference had nothing to do, well, somewhat was in their plan, but I think how they worked together was profoundly different. And that, again, was the key. Are they working together on the common good for the basin? And this is a different thing. When you're wearing your water management hat for your water district, your irrigation district, or whatever, you're responsible for the landowners within your jurisdiction. You put on that groundwater sustainability hat on, you're not responsible for just your jurisdiction. You're responsible for the sustainability of the entire basin. And until agencies get that mindset, they're not going to work together. The basin's not going to look like it's sustainable. The states, we're not going to be able to figure out what they're doing because they're all talking past each other and they're not coordinated, and they'll end up at the board. That's the big difference. And really the choice is whether they want to work together for the greater good and drop, parochialism, or they're going to stay with the board and eventually get an interim plan, which is going to be enormously catastrophic for the growers and the economy if the state has to come in and start doing pumping limits to get to sustainability. That'd be a failure on everyone's part, and I hope we don't get to that. But that's part of the law, and that may be coming down. So.
Hi, thank you for that. Well, that's loud. Thank you for that presentation. That was great. Watching you give that talk making me appreciate that. I'm glad I'm in my job and not yours. You've got a really challenging situation, but I'm glad you're in it doing that. So my name's Steve Astoy. I'm the director of the USDA Climate Hub. And my question is pretty simple. So you mentioned this, you have to consider the future, you have to consider the input, right? We know the future is going to look different. We know what we know about the future now is wrong, but it's the best information that we have. And I just pulled it up just to calibrate myself. When I look out using some of the best available data we have for California, independent of the emissions future that we realize here up in Shaver Lake, which is just to the east of us, we're expecting about the same amount of precipitation. We think that the form of that, as you noted, is going to change. We're going to get less snow, more rain, but by and large, across many years, it's going to be about the same. My question, though, is the biggest influence of change in California right now is wildfire, which is influencing significantly, presumably, and we don't have a handle on this, how water behaves on the landscape. My question for you is, how are you integrating that into your assessments, if at all?
Not so much typically the wildfire impacts outside of LA urban and Sonoma and everything largely falls up in foothills outside of basins. So, and being Butte County had our share of fires, Camp Fire and Park Fire 2 years ago, which was about 2 miles from my house. So got to see that coming up. Followed by floods and saw the sediment that was super different. I have a huge creek going through my property and floodwaters came down after that. So, one of the things we do talk to the GSAs, and this is important, them linking into the land use agencies, the upper foothills areas, the land use on that, whether burn scars or others, are important for the recharge source down in the basin. So integrating that is important. It's not the area that the agencies are responsible for because they're responsible for within basins. So there is a lot of research going on. Our Northern Region office is looking at some of the Park Fire burn scar, trying to look at dynamics on flows that are changing, what contaminants may be coming down from that, other metals or other naturally occurring kind of things. So the dynamics with the burn scar, it is changing things. So we are going to need some time and research, and I think that's where I think you all can really be helpful in trying to put some thought behind it, because some of the way these fires came through, I don't think anyone really could anticipate the changes and trying to figure out what does that future look like for the hydrology coming down from those water courses and other changes that are going to change. But back to climate change, I do want to touch on that, all the agencies were required to do climate change analysis as part of their plan. Most of them did two, probably the middle sort of scenario. We have a guidance document and models available for them to help support. So that was helpful. But frankly, that came out in 2018, the guidance, totally outdated, right? Doesn't reflect what's been going on the last 7 years. So one thing that was kicked around is like, do we want them all to update the models? All right, so that would take a couple years, couple $1 million, take them probably another 5 years, millions of dollars to get what? More data, right? On a shelf. So instead, what we're going to do is let that sit, and then there's a number of other analyses, climate change analyses that are coming out. One, the San Joaquin Valley Watershed Study was a good climate change analysis. So, but also the State Water Project did a reliability report about a year ago that included climate change and reported out the reliability of the State Water Project is going to decline roughly up 20% just because of climate change. inflows into Oroville and other facilities are going to be lessened and changed. And so the reliability of state water projects is going to go down because of climate change. And so we took that message, and even I think State Water Projects sent that out to the groundwater sustainability agencies and said, look, if you're making certain assumptions about deliveries of state water project, take a look at this report. You may need to adjust your water budget and maybe need to ramp up some other project and management actions because you may not be having the reliability of surface water from State Water Project or CVP that you thought with this climate change analysis. Similarly with recharge, if you've assumed sort of a certain amount of recharge, take a look at the analysis. You may or may not be hitting the mark. So as other programs coming up with climate change that are directly relevant to what decisions, management decisions locals have to do, we're getting that to them so they can make adjustments on the ground decisions on planning for the basin, taking this into account, rather than having them redo, a whole modeling exercise. So if that makes sense. Yes.
Thank you, Paul, for the great presentation. My question relates to demand management. What role do you see demand management having as one of the many management actions that can help groundwater basins achieve sustainability in addition to recharge? And is DWR doing anything to help these basins adopt different forms of demand management?
Thanks. You must have been looking at my notes because I was going to mention demand management and I forgot. So, yeah, demand management, it's, balancing the books, right? So either everyone's focused on putting more water in, kind of increasing that bank account, but you also need to stop spending and stop your extraction. And so one of the things is the vast majority of the basins and the basins we're talking about are not going to be able to recharge their way out of their deficit. They're not. I think the focus, and I think rightfully so, has been on what can we do to maximize recharge and getting water in the basin, which I agree is being at the local level. And this is easier than working at the local level, I will say, because starting off with demand management is a difficult conversation. So we've been kind of instructing those agencies when we've reviewed plans, if they were very aspirational on projects like, we think we're going to get all this other water. We're like, we're not really sure you can do that. You might want to think about demand management because we'll be back taking a look at basin conditions and that sort. So we've started to see an uptick in demand management now that I think people got their legs under them on recharge. It's an area that we are not providing specific guidance on for a lot of reasons. One is the discussions locally with the landowners and growers on how you construct a demand management program is very different. And it's very circumstantial to the, I'd say, the characteristics of the basin and how it's negotiated out locally, which really is at the heart of local management. So, that's something we've steered away from on wanting to put our thumb on how local agencies do it. Because I use an extreme example, and there's probably no attorneys in the room, but hypothetically, if let's say a basin gets together and they want to do an allocation based upon some roulette wheel and everyone gets a random sort of allocation number and they all agree and no one fights and that's it, and it reduces the extraction to get to a sustainability, we don't care. It's probably illegal, but if no one challenges it, it can go through. And there are things out there that we may look and kind of go, we don't think that complies with the law. But if locals are doing it and no one squawks, no issues, they can go do it. So, but what we've also been encouraged by, there's a newly emerging demand management network that's popped up. And some of you are familiar with the Floodmar network, which is sort of like on the Floodmar side, that peer-to-peer, getting the groups together, experts, and sort of cross-sharing information. Sort of the analogous thing is starting on demand management. And this is something the department will go in, will help support like we do with Floodmar. We won't kind of impose sort of our views on it, on approaches, but it will bring agencies that have gone through the challenges to be able to share with their peers on how to go about doing it, real examples about other approaches that agencies have taken, and they do run the gambit. So that's going to happen. And then we're also somewhat keeping track of how water trading programs get going. Some of them real infancy, but there's interest in us making sure there are some guardrails up on how water trading goes within basins, just so you don't exacerbate undesirable results. But, you know, we're not, it's real difficult because there are going to be, you know, people don't want us to weigh in and avoid having people become winners or losers, and, you know, it gets a lot more complicated when you get down that end. So, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.